what trust in institutions is going to exist in Ukrainian society? Well, how do we not see a period like the Irish Troubles in occupied territory? There's so many questions that are left unanswered if we accept this type of large defeat on behalf of the Ukrainians, almost, which to them is going to feel like snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory.
What's up, Dylan?
Not much. Just doing my show, going about my day. So, I've noticed a few times. Every time you're in chat, it's like the first message you drop down. It's like, Dylan, the need to negotiate is now. We must negotiate a deal, a peace. What is your position, and what do you disagree with me on here?
Well, I would say, I'm not even like coming like from a malicious fucking side of like, from a malicious side. Like I'm not fucking pro-Russian. I'm not pro-Putin. The invasion was shitty. I don't believe in like denazification of Ukraine. None of that bullshit, right? But I'm strictly talking just warfare. Wouldn't it be better for Ukraine to advocate for a peace deal right now? Because this is their best position that they have in the war?
When you say it's in their best interest to advocate for a peace deal right now, the Ukrainians did propose a 10-point peace plan, I think a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago.
It's still public. Yeah.
I know that they're going to host some sort of peace summit probably early next year, maybe another Doha summit, something along those lines. But that's been public knowledge for a while. I'm of the position that the Ukrainian and Russian positions are so separate, they're so far apart, where some people are of the position that the Russians just want to hold on to what they have. I don't think that's the case.
But they're going on an offensive still,
well, yeah, the Russians are going on an offensive. They want to take the rest of the Donbass. This is something that the Vladimir Putin said from the start. This is something he's been setting out to do since 2014. He's going to continue to pursue. And the Ukrainians want to take back all the land that has been taken from them in the last 8 years, and that they've shown that have been able to at least take back 50% of the land taken since 2022.
Yes, but there's a big caveat to that. There's a big caveat to what you just said. Like in Kharkiv and in Kherson, the Russian lines were not fortified the way they have fortified their lines now in south of Zaporozhye and fucking the Donbass.
Yeah, the defensive situation is different. Yes. That is true, but it is also true that they've liberated over 50% of the territory that the Russians captured.
100%.
Since 2022.
I mean, sure. Yes,
well, my point is, though, the Russian and Ukrainian position are completely separate, and I don't see any way to bring those two positions together in the near future, or that the Russians have given any indication that they're willing to do that. On top of the fact that even if they do give an indication that they're willing to do that, we've already gone through 200 rounds of negotiation, 12 negotiated ceasefires, all of which have failed for a variety of reasons. I would not be so confident in one of these things to succeed, especially given Russia's track record and, staying in line when it comes to these ceasefires. And so there's a fear that if there isn't something structural put in place to stop a future Russian invasion, like Ukrainian NATO membership, like some unilateral defense pact between the United States and Ukraine, which, according to the Russians, part of the reason they invaded in the first place was to stop something like that. Unless there's something like that put in place, how am I supposed to sit down with the Russians and negotiate this seriously?
That's something that, like if you say that, like if Ukraine will be accepted in NATO, I don't even think the Russians will respect it at this point, right? Like that shit's out of the fucking question. But
what do you mean that when you say that shit's out of the question? Do you mean to the Russians, or do you mean just like this is impossible?
Like
the Russians won't accept it, but that's the only proven model to stop the Russians from invading you, even if the Russians want to invade you.
I would say it would be better to advocate for some type of peace deal with new borders and give up the fight to like stop to take Mariupol. Because when you say that, like, that the Ukrainians went after they had the counteroffensive, that they try to go on the offensive, right? And I've been saying that for fucking 6 months now. Like, dude, It's gonna fail. It's gonna completely fail, just like the Russian offensive failed.
Okay, wait.
because of-
You were saying for months that it was going to fail because of what? Where did you study military strategy? I just wanna.
The Twitter.
Twitter. Okay, gotcha. Okay. I just want us all. It's just like I just want us all to acknowledge, like, I saw their military plans and I acknowledge the deep flaws in their deep strategy. Like,
it doesn't take a genius. It doesn't take a genius to see what happens in current warfare, like mobilized, like blitzkrieg warfare, like in the old days when you were able to take defensive lines and roll through them. That's fucking gone, man.
That's still not necessarily true. It all depends on the environment, the weapons used, how the fighting, how it sets in, how fast the fighting is. For example, 20 years ago, invasion of Iraq lasted a few weeks, 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks.
That they have now, Dylan.
What do you mean okay, so you think if the Iraqi army had...
Did the Iraqi army have S-400s? Did they have fucking javelins or cornets? Did they have fucking unbelievably fields full of landmines? Like, come on, that's...
Okay.
Anyway,
even if the Iraqi army had many of those things, I think the war probably would have gone the same.
It wouldn't have it wouldn't have been a four-day fucking war. It would have been fucking more prolonged months. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Okay, so I think it probably maybe wouldn't have been a 3.5 weeks. Maybe it would have been 4 weeks. Maybe 4.5 weeks. But when you look at the landscape of Iraq, right? When you look at the airspace of Iraq and how quickly it was dominated, or you look at any of these factors, the geography, the geopolitical, there were so many different things that led to the war going quickly. There's nothing about how this war has gone that has told me that the future of warfare is now all future wars are going to look like this. There's a bunch of reasons why this war has looked like this. In fact, this war has looked like this over the last 8 years as well. Much of the last 8 years of the semi-frozen conflict and much of the fighting around Avdiivka, which is a hot spot right now, has seen a lot of trench warfare, has seen warfare that isn't exactly like what we're seeing today, but is eerily reminiscent of what we're seeing today. A lot of positional fighting. But even through that positional fighting, once the big invasion came in 2022, large swaths of land still traded hands. There's a question about this. It did.
I disagree with it.
I mean, you would say that the Russians didn't capture large swaths of land at the start of the war?
Wherever you didn't have these defensive lines, like the South was where Ukraine lost more land, right? In Kherson, in South of Zaporozhye, you didn't have the defensive lines that you had in Donetsk.
Well, yes, of course, but your premise, though, if I was to understand it, is that the future of warfare is here. Like, we're not going to see fast wars like we did with concepts like blitzkrieg anymore. The future of war is going to look like World War I. This is essentially the premise. But then, wait. But then it's like, well, not exactly. It's just anywhere where extensive fortifications are built, it's going to take a lot of energy and will and attacks and dredging through the mud and muck in order to take those positions. Well, yes. Okay. That's very different, though, than saying the future of warfare is going to look like Donetsk everywhere.
Why are we arguing stupid semantics? Like,
you said this is a problem with like technology developed this way, and so now there is no way for Ukraine to liberate its territory.
Well, that's why I'm going to give you an example. Which I think is silly. Ukraine didn't know that there was 5 strong defensive lines in the south of Zaporozhye, and they attacked anyway. They send their men. Like, to me, in my eyes, they send all those men to fucking die. Like, they knew that this was in fact, the State Department, the American State Department, knew that they were not going to be able to break through those lines.
That's not
There's
true.
Like evidence now. I have the fucking article, man.
You have an article saying that the Ukrainians have...
They had their doubts. They had their doubts. Of course, they didn't say.
Okay, yes, well then what just... Okay, it took 30 seconds for the walk back.
If a fucking idiot like me could also see that, dude, like, you're going to try to break through 5 fucking lines head on, that's not going to happen.
So
now we're fucking here with thousands of casualties and armor and all the losses that fucking Ukraine took for no fucking reason, for a dream.
For a dream. Okay. So first off, I just want to throw out there, nobody knew how the counteroffensive exactly was going to go. It was dependent on a bunch of unknowns. It was unknown exactly how much munitions and weapons the Ukrainians were going to actually deploy in said attack. It was unknown exactly when they were going to be able to do it, if they were going to be able to do it earlier, right when the spring came, or later in the spring,
So your argument is that they were dicking around with lives and just fuck it, just send them in, let's see what happens?
Okay, so I'm just going to keep saying what I said, and I'm just going to pretend you didn't say anything, because I don't... Okay, so...
Go ahead.
As I was saying... Fuck, what was it? God damn it, you son of a bitch, you made me lose what I was saying.
I'm sorry, dude. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Fuck. They didn't know when they were going to be able to attack. They didn't know how much means they were going to have at their disposal, how much the West was actually going to dedicate to some offensive. We ended up sending them like over 30 Abrams that didn't even get there in time. Much of the aid that we had committed had not gotten there in time. And the type of combined arms warfare that Ukraine was going to have to engage in for the first time on such a large scale. Well, it was not the first time they've attempted to it, but it would be the first time they've attempted it at such a large scale with the dream of success. There were so many different factors that came together that led to the failure. I think the aid not being given fast enough, so they had more time to build up the fortifications, definitely was one of the problems. I think one of the problems was a failure of combined arms warfare to coordinate the artillery strikes with the first assault teams. When the first artillery strikes were made, there was a 3-hour gap before the first assaults were made, and those are problems that got balanced out later. Many of these issues would be resolved with time, or would be kind of hammered out with time, but that initial momentum never really changed. We could try to change different factors to see if that counteroffensive could have gone differently. If they got more equipment earlier on, 2 to 3 months earlier, before the Surovikin line was as dense as it was, and they were able to do a combined arms warfare and train the Western trained forces better in the actual warfare they were going to be fighting, instead of urban warfare, which seemed to be the focus of much of the training, even though in Zaporozhia there's not really much open warfare to be seen. It's all fighting on big wide trenches. Fields, trying to take trenches. This is all adjustments that are now being made in the Western training is now focusing on trench warfare and assaulting trenches. We're seeing these adjustments made between coordinating the artillery strikes and the assaults more hand in hand. That those adjustments are being made. The West is at least attempting to increase aid shipments or keep them steady into the future, with the Europeans setting gaudy goals like 1 million shells at the end of the year, which they almost certainly are not going to hit for this year. They'll probably hit maybe 52% of the goal.
Let's just say that.
But my point is to you is that there are so many different factors that led to the failure, that if we were to change a few of these factors, and the offensive was able to start earlier, maybe we could have gotten a different outcome. But my main point to you is that the war isn't frozen forever, as in it's impossible for the land to move, because if the factors were just different, even with this offensive, the offensive could have gone differently.
It will be unsustainable, though. Like the losses that you take when you try to advance this and I'm not saying, I'm not like giving Russia like, oh, because Russia's such a great army or whatever. Russia also took those fucking losses, right? Mm-hmm. In the beginning of the war, because of the javelins.
I mean, the Russians took all of the. If we were to compare the data that we have from OSCENT, from open source intelligence, it looks like the Russians lost about what the Ukrainians lost in Avdiivka in about 3 weeks, right? Yeah, those are pretty massive losses. So this is I want to be clear that for the Russians to take any inch of land, it's going to be extremely costly as well, just like it is for the Ukrainians. By the end of what was that? Any
advancing army, on any side. Because
not necessarily any advancing army, but in this war specifically, absolutely.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Like, it's unsustainable. Like how much does a javelin cost? Like a javelin missile, 60K or something? Some shit like that, right? It blows up a fucking, a T-90 tank with one fucking shell? I mean, that's...
A T-90 is more expensive than a javelin.
Well, For sure, and that same vice versa. A coordinated
Wait. Why would it be not cost effective for something less expensive than a T-90 to blow up a T-90?
Well, who's taking the loss? It's the advancing army, right?
Yes, the person who lost the T-90, yeah.
But now switch it around. A fucking Leopard or an Abrams getting hit by a fucking Cornet and blowing the fuck up. Same shit.
Yeah, I do think that. Well, I do think the conditions are slightly different. I would say for one, the biggest issue all around for the Ukrainians is going to be loss of personnel. Definitely for when it comes to these armored crews. There's just
against Russia. Yeah, I agree. Like Russia has more.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
There's a massive population difference between Ukraine and Russia, which is part of the reason why I want to send Western gear and Western tanks. If there's anything that Abrams tanks are known for, and a lot more of the Western carrier, more modern Western carriers like the Bradleys and stuff like that are known for, it's for trying to protect their crews, either by encasing the ammunition or by using, I don't know all of the fancy tricks on how to make a tank more safe, but an Abrams is much more tank than the Pop Goes the Weasel tank model of the T-72, and the crews that are getting injured or getting attacked in a lot of these more modern Western gear, something I've noticed definitely with the start of the Zaporozhye counteroffensive is how many of those armored vehicles that were given to them that were Western, when they were destroyed or damaged, had the tops opened up from the crews being able to escape. Yeah. Well, not the jack in the box, not the top falling off. I mean the hatch where the soldiers get in and out being open, indicating that the soldiers inside, once the vehicle was damaged beyond repair or damaged to a point where they couldn't get it out of there, got out of the vehicle and fled, which is going to be less likely in an old, aging, 60-year-old I don't want to call it T-shit can, but like a lot safer model. And so I believe Western gear can help try to supplement for some of Ukraine's shortfalls in comparison to fighting a much larger power like Russia.
It will save a life, whatever, right? Let's go with what you said.
Well, it'd save the crews, which would be the most important part. Like, you can replace a tank, but the crews are a lot harder to replace.
Well, that's what I mean, though. But can you replace a tank? Can you replace the Bradleys fast enough for you to continue an offensive of that magnitude?
If the West wanted to, absolutely. So. It's a question of whether we have the political will to do so, I think.
Decommission. I mean, as soon as you decommission a we agree, right? It takes one ATGM shot or maybe a mine or whatever. You're fucked. Like, you're useless. That's why we've given
Ukraine 31 tanks. I think we have 2,600 active Abrams and 6,000 sitting on storage units across the country in like the Arizona desert. The idea that we couldn't produce them like another 100 or 200 tanks, or it would be like logistically impossible for the United States to sustain such a loss. Nah, we could. It's a question of if we want to. It's a question of if we weigh Ukraine to be enough of a strategic priority for us to give more and more of our tanks for the Ukrainians to make up a larger portion of their armor arsenal. I think that's the question, not whether is it possible for us to fund it. Yeah, it's absolutely possible for us to fund it. We've spent 5% of our Pentagon spending on Ukraine. Yes, we could do that.
I mean, I agree with you. We can send them whatever the fuck we want, but I don't think my point is that it won't make a difference. Like,
how could you possibly say that after seeing how the war has gone so far? I don't understand that. At every stage, the Western aid that we end up giving, well, number one, you're just talking about one part of the front line. Here's an example. Let's say that river crossing that the Ukrainians are doing across the Dnipro continues to expand, and they're able to establish some sort of bridge, some sort of logistical unit in order to sustain operations, to go around the defensive positions. Could that not be utilized by the Ukrainians in order to liberate swaths of territory, to go around the Surovikin line that you're very worried about? Now that comes with its own issues, that comes with its own problems, but there isn't only one front line in the entirety of this war.
Well, you're gonna run into the same fucking problems. You're gonna need Bradleys. You're gonna need fucking Abrams.
Well, you're gonna need armored vehicles, but you're not gonna have to attack the same positions. But yes, again, that's why I'm saying the West should send more armored vehicles. That's why I think the West should increase ammunition production more and invest more into it.
My point is that I just don't see them getting even to Mariupol. And it was shown in this fucking counteroffensive. Like, I mean, we could go into the losses about how much they took, and it was just like, to me, it's irrelevant. It was no.
What do you mean going into the losses? So what were the losses to you?
Thousands of men. Maybe
thousands of
about
what is that? What is that means? Hearing that number means nothing to me. What do you mean thousands of men? Like that could mean like if the Ukrainians lost thousands of men, but the Russians lost tens of thousands of men. Well, then it was worthwhile. From what I know about the counteroffensive, or from what I've been told, at the start, the offensives, the losses were the hardest for the Ukrainians, and then after a few months, after like a month in, or after the first initial wave of mechanized offensive failed, the Ukrainians changed up their strategy to prioritize smaller assault groups. Their losses steeply declined, and they balanced out to a roughly 1-to-1 ratio, from what I know. In comparison to what we're seeing in Avdiivka, where the Russians are taking much higher losses than the Ukrainians.
Yeah, the Russians are going on the offensive.
Now, at the end of the day, 1-to-1 losses for the Ukrainians is not good from a nutritional standpoint, because the Russians have, again, more people than the Ukrainians do. But the Ukrainians can also, number one, like fight along the other parts of the line where the losses are much higher. They can dedicate more of their society to the war as a total percentage, because they're engaged in total war, while the Russians have interests other places in Syria. They have interests all across Africa. They have to have soldiers all across, the largest country in the world. I think there are ways for the Ukrainians try to make up for the difference in population size.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Wouldn't it be, even by your standards, wouldn't it be better for Ukraine to try to seek a peace deal so the Ukrainians can set up... What
peace deal does that mean? Like, what peace deal? Are we talking? Because if the peace deal is give up Donetsk and Luhansk, they're just going to say no.
Gonna happen. I mean, in my opinion, that's stupid as fuck coming from Ukraine. Because you can set up your own defensive lines, and there's no way the Russians will ever be able to break through the way through in the beginning of the war, or have like a breakthrough anywhere.
Well, okay, so here's 2 points. The first point is, so you're going to be the Ukrainian politician to go on a stage and say, 100,000 people in Kramatorsk, leave your homes, leave your city, abandon it. We're giving it to the Russians. To the people of Seversk, abandon your homes. You must leave. You must be displaced. We have to hand it to the Russians. So you're going to be the Ukrainian leader.
So you're saying what's the alternative? Continue the war, deplete more men, and we've established that Russia has to meet.
Okay. We haven't. We've established that Russia has a higher population than Ukraine, but having a higher population does not mean you win the war. If that's the case, then the Russians should have won the first Chechen War, and the Soviets should have won the war in Afghanistan, and we should have won the war in Vietnam. There's a lot of wars that we should have won.
That's guerrilla warfare, dude.
Do you not think that the Ukrainians would not be willing to resort to guerrilla warfare, which they have already done in occupied territory through car bombings, assassinations, sabotage of logistical lines, but... Dude, every time I feel like we're jumping around so quickly. No points have actually concretely, I feel like, been made. Where were we? What were we talking about before we got derailed?
I think, or no, like if you want to be the Ukrainian politician to tell these cities that you have to abandon.
We're talking about having hundreds of thousands of people leave their homes, on top of telling all the people who have already fled their homes, you're never going to be able to return home. Not only is there a question of whether this is smart, because we'd be giving up some of the best defensive lines with the Russians to the Russians, lines that have been built up since 2014, like, for example, Avdiivka, which has delivered massive losses to the Russians, but it's also going to be a massive humanitarian disaster to their own people as they displace their own people in a peace deal. And what makes you so certain that if they were to make this deal, that the Russians wouldn't just invade again? coming to the conclusion that, hey man, this was successful. We got all this land, we got all this. We'll wait for the West to stop paying attention. We'll just invade again.
That's where I say I go into that. What's the number in Avdiivka right now? Like the Russians are like 50%.
I think they've lost 10,000 soldiers in the last 10 days.
How much is the city? Like who? It's like a 50-50 or. I can't remember what.
I mean, they're not in the city yet. They're fighting over garbage heaps in villages around the city currently.
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, that's what I wanted to say. For me, in my eyes, it would be better for Russia, for Ukraine to have an international peace deal with a lot of countries, China, the United States, all the big players, right? Mm-hmm. Come in, say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. These are the borderlines here. And then you have it. This is why I say that Russia would never see it that way. And we're just going to invade again. Because Ukraine is going to be, instead of fighting a war of attrition now, where they're depleting men, armor, arms, weapons, shells, everything that they're fighting now, they're going to have time to regroup, set up even stronger defensive lines. And in any of the fucking case that Russia ever thinks about invading, you know what's going to happen to them.
Why didn't that work for the Chechens?
Different time and a different type of warfare, and they didn't have the fucking entire world fucking funding the shit out of them the way Ukraine
doesn't have the entire world funding the shit out of them. Okay, Ukraine has the Western world funding the shit out of them. And also, there's a few things. The first thing I would like to say is a lot of times when people make plans, and this is something I did when I was a kid. I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to be the best at boxing. I loved boxing. And I took time off of high school, went out and I trained boxing, and I would see somebody and see how good they are. And I was like, I want to get to that point. And then I'd get to that point after months and months and months of getting my ass whooped and going out there hitting the bag. And then I'd get in the ring with that guy, and that guy would beat the shit out of me. And I'd get out of the ring confused because I had gotten up to his point. But in those months, that guy had also trained. That guy had also gotten better. In the period that Ukraine uses to rebuild after abandoning their best defensive positions and trying to build new defensive positions, assuming there's not going to be a demilitarized zone, which the Russians could take advantage of, which there probably would be. What would stop the Russians from also building up and preparing for another war, which they did after 2014?
In that scenario, what is more likely? We did establish this. The advancing army takes way heavier losses than the fucking defensive army.
So right? your question to me is, what's more likely after 200 rounds of failed negotiation and 12 failed ceasefires? What's more likely, that this new one succeeds after we make the Ukrainians give up their best defensive positions and more land up to the Russians, rewarding their behavior? What's more likely, that the Russians say, that's enough empire, I guess. It would be too costly to continue. We as the Russians are known for our deep love of our soldiers and not to throw away their lives willy-nilly. And then they'll turn around and go home.
What's the alternative, though? To just continue in this war of attrition and continue to see now men over and over?
See, now you understand why diplomacy failed. Because the Russian and Ukrainian positions are irreconcilable. They're irreconcilable.
You don't think that this, like, you barely have now fucking, I think like a month ago, there was a story about how
look, let me be blunt with you. I don't think we should negotiate any deal with the Russians that does not guarantee that they would not invade again. And when I say guarantee, I mean physical guarantee, as in if they do, then it's going to be American troops versus Russian troops. And that is the only path to that would most likely be NATO membership or unilateral defense treaty, which the Russians don't want.
Well, no. Well, NATO treaty, I think who knows how that would turn out, but I would agree with having. Well, no,
the NATO treaty would work in defending Ukraine. It would work in defending Ukraine. The Russians just don't want it, no matter what.
The EU would even fucking take that offer up. Like, would they, with the war going on? Okay, we're just gonna let Ukraine into NATO.
Not during, like, probably part of some peace treaty. That would be the idea.
Yeah, who knows? But I would, like, even the fucking Chinese deal. Remember, there was a Chinese deal where China was like, okay, we're going to have an international safe zone or whatever the fuck. Like, it was a demilitarized zone, like you said. but we're going to have international troops with a whole bunch of countries. But I would agree with something like that too. I mean, the Russians, I don't know, included. I don't know, right? But
can I be blunt with you, man? Let's look at what kind of deal we're asking the Ukrainians to shake with and deal with. So not only
it's politically, you can say it's political suicide for
it's political and national suicide.
The alternative, Dylan. That's my fucking point.
The alternative is to keep fighting, yes, to defend the homes that you would abandon in Donetsk and Luhansk, because the Russians...
unsustainable, dude.
When you say it's unsustainable, what you're saying is that the Russian population is higher than the Ukrainian population, and the Russians have more guns and bombs, therefore the Ukrainians inevitably will lose. Just like Vietnam did, and Afghanistan did, and all these other countries did.
Russia will be able to push to even Zaporozhye city. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think they're ever going to go to West Ukraine or none of that.
You do know that they annexed Zaporozhye too. They declared the annexation of Zaporozhye, so this would maybe be one of their demands. What is that? A city of like 600 to 1,000 people, 600,000 to 1 million people. You know, I know a lot of people from there. I guess I got to go tell them to pack their shit up and leave, because there'll be no civil society by the time the Russians get there. What do you mean? What? I mean, this is the reality of like negotiating these borders. See, for a lot of Westerners, it's very easy to take out a marker and just start like drawing on the map. You know, for the British, it's like I would have said, it's almost like, drinking tea. Just get a inclination, you got to go do it. But what we're doing here is we're splitting up families, right? We're splitting up families. We're splitting up a country. We're splitting up people. And we're saying to the people in occupied territory and to the people we're now going to say, we're giving up the fight for your home. We're going to let the Russians take your house, right? We're going to let the Russians take your village. We're going to let the Russians take your city. We're basically telling them, if you want to enshrine this as the peace deal, assuming that it succeeds and you haven't just given them this land, we're enshrining the occupation over millions of people. That means there's no existence of a civil society. That means it's a suppression and eradication of the Ukrainian national identity, which is the explicit goal of the Russian government. We're going to see 80% at minimum of Ukraine's coastline being absorbed, tons of its farmland being absorbed. I do want to throw out there the fact that transporting grain, transporting wheat, transporting any type of perishable farm goods by rail costs 10 times more than it does to transport it by water, which is going to be an issue anytime the Russians control Crimea or 80% of the coastline, which they do currently. There's going to be tons of people who are going to permanently be stuck in occupied territory because they own their homes or they don't have the money to move. And there's going to be tons of people who can't go back to occupied territory because they're ties to the government, they're ties to journalists, ties to civil society. And so my fear is, if this is the society that we accept because the toll is too high, and we've come to the conclusion that after the Russians have lost 30% of their armor reserves, they've been pushed off of 50% of the territory they've taken since the start of the 2022 invasion, taking massive losses that they haven't taken since the First and Second World War. And we're supposed to look at the situation and say the only conclusion is it's unsustainable because we haven't even really tried yet. But even if we give the Ukrainians the best equipment in the world, the Russians have more people, just can't be done. We shouldn't even try.
Okay, that's a good, I'll cover your first point that you said about the fucking sending grain through.
Well, no, it's rail. Just like there's so much damage that's going to be done to Ukraine. How hard would it be for like the ultra nationalists in Ukraine to look around and say, the West has abandoned us once again. We are now a rump state. We have all lost our homes. This liberal democracy thing was fucking stupid. It failed us again. The Russians took our land and the West let them. And then, what trust in institutions is going to exist in Ukrainian society? Well, how do we not see a period like the Irish Troubles in occupied territory? There's so many questions that are left unanswered. If we accept this type of large defeat on behalf of the Ukrainians, which to them is going to feel like snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory.
To the Ukrainians. Even after this counteroffensive.
Yes, really absolutely. Yes.
Anyway, like I'll address your first point of the grain for sure. That's the first thing I fucking said in this war when I was planning out. I said the Russians are trying to take over the South because they want to make Ukraine
I hate to interrupt you, but 3 months before they invaded in December of 2021, they were preparing the equipment to steal Ukraine's grain. They were preparing it 3 months before the war even started. So, I mean, they were definitely planning that for a while.
They were trying to take the ports. That's what I meant. Like, they were trying to take Mariupol, Melitopol, whatever, all the port cities, Kherson. I think more than, like, the north. But who cares? That's irrelevant. Okay, but the other point, like you said, oh, you're going to tell these families to leave. You're going to tell this, and that. I mean, you could say the same thing about the Vietnam War. You could say the same thing about Afghanistan. You could say you're just going to go into Kabul and tell all the people that you had your army there, the Afghan army was being trained by the United States. Oh, too bad. We have to leave. We've been here for fucking 20 years. You have your lifestyle like this. What can we do?
Wait, but aren't both of those examples of the people not compromising with what would be considered traditionally the occupier and then holding out and winning? With much less means than the Ukrainians had?
Well, you're saying like the Taliban, right?
Well, I meant the Mujahideen.
I'm talking about the Mujahideen, whatever. But I'm talking about the Afghan army, where the Afghan army had control. America.
I think there's a big difference between the ANA and the Ukrainians, whereas the Ukrainians like fought tooth and nail for the cities, and while they have issues with corruption, they were not as deep as the Afghan issues, as some of them had been resolved in the last 8 years, 9 years in Ukraine. I mean, I think the most evident difference would be, well, just look at the difference when the Russians marched on Kiev, a much stronger power than the fucking Taliban is, and look at the difference when the Taliban marched on Kabul.
Can you say the same thing? Can you say the same thing about or fucking Melitopol or Donetsk? What do you think is going to happen if the Ukrainians?
Wait, are you telling me that I think? Okay, so you're asking about the possibility of like a guerrilla war in the Donetsk region against Ukrainian reclamation?
First of all, I don't even think they'll ever get to Donetsk. But yes, at this point, honestly, I think the guerrilla war would happen against fucking Ukraine.
How would that work, and what gave you that point? At this point, I mean, it seems like you didn't think that before, so there must be something that moved you that way.
People have lived under Russian control areas. I mean, you have gotten guerrilla warfare. I agree with you. You've gotten like sabotage groups, whatever, right? Placing bombs on fucking railways. But you haven't gotten the type of fucking guerrilla warfare that you saw in the dedication guerrilla warfare that you saw in Afghanistan or Vietnam.
Well, the reason why you haven't is because the only way the Taliban had to resist was through guerrilla warfare. The Ukrainians have multiple means to resist. Both guerrilla warfare, assassinations, bombings, poisonings, drone attacks, all sorts of things, on top of their more traditional, conventional military means of a 1 million strong army. If you want to fight against the Russians, you don't need to like take up a rifle and like hide in the bushes and try to organize ambushes with you and a couple of your buddies. You just need to go to the local recruitment office.
Oh, okay, sure. Now, another point in Donetsk. That went on for fucking 8 years or whatever, since 2014.
2014, yeah, they've occupied it for 8 years.
Yeah, they all bombed each other. Let's be real. I want to get into it. I'm not one of those fucking tankies. 14,000 here and there, all this bullshit. But you did have people die. I mean, you have innocents die, victims die in all wars, right?
I would make
have that fucking.
Okay.
Go ahead, then.
I mean, my first point would be, before the 2022 invasion, 50% of the population of Donetsk and Luhansk had left. These are people who had left due to the crushing of the civil society, the crushing of economic opportunity. Maybe they had a bad relationship with the new ruling criminals, because the people who took over in Donetsk and Luhansk was a combination of Russian collaborators, gangsters, paramilitary groups, FSB agents. You get the idea. Yeah. And for whatever reason, the state of affairs in Donetsk had caused 50% of the population to leave. Now, of the 50% who stayed and the people who have moved in since then, I assume that amongst them is a high level of collaborationism or high level of sympathy for the occupation.
Yes.
But if you account for the 50% who have left, which I think we could both assume that the vast majority of those who left do not have a good view of the people who took over. If you're leaving because of a governmental change, you probably don't like the government that took over. That's 50%. So
what is more likely? What is more likely? You could say
I didn't even finish my point.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So 50% of the people left don't support. And let's say 60 to 70 or whatever percent of the people who are left do support the occupation, whatever it might be. In total, if 50% left, then even if assuming that like 90 to 80% of the people who stayed support the occupation, the majority of the Donetsk, the majority of the people from there are still against the occupation. It's just the math would be impossible to find enough people in the Donbass for Russia to be the predominantly popular force there, especially after what they did in 2022. So now you combine that with the fact that the Russians have heavily recruited to the last man in Donetsk and Luhansk, grabbing people who were going to like kindergarten to pick up their kids, having very, very high recruitment requirements because they recruited as much as they could through occupied territory before they eventually resulted to mass mobilization. I don't know if there are enough men left to resist if the Ukrainians actually got there, because the Russians might have just recruited them all.
Now, okay, let's put that into perspective, what you just said. So you're going to have this invaded army, the Ukrainian invaded army. It's going to go into Donetsk, not just Donetsk, the villages around it, the towns around it, everything.
Yes.
People are going to lose their homes. People are going to lose family members. People are going to, and I'm not just talking about men. You're also going to have women, children, whatever. You don't think that they're going to look at that army? They're not going to look at the Ukrainian army with more as a resentment than everything you just said about the Russian army. You think they're going to look at the Russian army as the aggressors and not the people of Donetsk?
Many of them will resent the Russians more. Many of the people in occupied territory absolutely resent the Russians more. If it's a majority of the people, I don't know. But do I think there'll be enough resentment of the Ukrainians returning that they'll fight a guerrilla war into like months after they've taken over? No. No, I don't. I think the most likely collaboration that you could expect is maybe like leaking of coordinates to the Russians, which is something that already occurs all throughout Ukrainian territory. Much of it from economic incentive.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's my point in the whole beginning was you're going to have this resistance in Donetsk, in Luhansk, more of a probability of having resistance in this than they would align themselves with the
What was it like when
army.
Kherson was liberated?
It was for sure Kherson, but Kherson had barely been liberated by fucking Russia, right? And was there guerrilla
in favor of the Russians? Not that I know of. There was Ukrainian resistance tactics. There were like assassinations and car bombings, but I'm not familiar with any Russian guerrilla warfare in Kherson after it was retaken. Maybe like a few bombs that they left behind.
Yeah, but I mean, that's 1 year of occupation, or not even like fucking 8 months of occupation.
I understand that the conditions are different. It's just, I don't think that, considering how that went, and considering how many people are going to be rushing to come back to Donetsk after it's retaken, if they're given the opportunity to do so safely, that there's going to be enough of any sort of resistance effort locally, grassroots, to throw the Ukrainians away after they would push away the Russian army. I don't buy that.
Yeah, well, it's a hypothetical anyway, dude. So that was my point, Dylan. Like, if you want to go ahead with your stream, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but my point is that I just don't see how the Ukraine, even let's just.
So but what is the thing that's unsustainable according to you? Is it
an offensive war from any army, from any military?
Okay, but if it's also not sustainable for the Russians, then
exactly.
Then wait. and this is a really sad thing about war, but this is true. Sometimes wars keep going due to how separate the two positions are. This is especially true with civil wars, until one side quite literally punches themselves out. And the other side doesn't win because of tactical genius. The other side doesn't win because of some grand, brilliant maneuver. The other side wins is because the other guy just cannot keep fighting.
More likely, Russia winning that war or Ukraine winning that war?
It would completely depend on the factors involved and how much the West is willing to back Ukraine. If the West doesn't back Ukraine at all, then I think that Russia would probably, at the very least, win it in the short term. A guerrilla war.
100%.
But I mean, when it comes to if the West was to back Ukraine to its full potential, I think Ukraine would have a really good chance of winning. I just don't know if the West is going to do that, as we can see from much of the political mumbo jumbo that's going on in DC right now.
Can you give me a weapon that can get through? Like you think the F-16 would make a difference? You think
okay, number one, I don't believe in Wunderwaffen. Okay, I don't believe in the wonder weapon coming in and like changing the outlook of the battlefield permanently. But there are weapons that you add that are going to change the amount of tools in Ukraine's tool belt that allows them to be more flexible in different situations. For example, the HIMARS were absolutely extremely useful to the Ukrainians. Well, I wouldn't say revolutionary, but it strained Russian logistics. It made them have to bring back their ammo depots. They lost tons of people in ammo depots. A lot of their formations, as they're preparing to attack, get destroyed by HIMARS strikes all the time. Training centers, stuff like that. It really augmented the Ukrainians' abilities when they gave them the one like half distance ATACMS, the ATACMS that can only go 165 kilometers, not 300. One of the older, like 50, 60-year-old models, they were still able to use it to take out Russian helicopters. They're able to use it very effectively. Much of the problem I find with Ukrainian aid to Ukraine is sometimes it's not that they give them the ability or the capability like the longer range ATACMS, but most of the time it is they give them the tool, but they'll give them in such small a quantity that the Ukrainians have to use it so sparingly that they're preserving ammunition that just holds them back tremendously. It's a question of quantity.
The HIMARS is great. It's a revolutionary weapon. It has the precision of a fucking drone, but the power of a fucking MLRS or whatever the fuck they call those, 100%. But is a HIMARS gonna get you to be able to the city of Mariupol, for example? I just don't see it.
Okay, do you want me to tell you the things that I think Ukraine would need to transform the battlefield enough for them to push the Russians back? Is that what you want me to name? Or because for example, I would say that if the Ukrainians could fire 1/2 of the shells, or how about 3/4 or 4/5 of the shells that the Russians do, not even 1-to-1, that would be such a tremendous increase and do such damage to the Russians, depending upon accuracy, of course. If the Ukrainians can keep anything close to their current accuracy levels, that would definitely revolutionize the Ukrainians' position on the battlefield.
You would need mass production. Right?
Yes, exactly. That's dependent on Western investments in production of artillery shells.
Even there, you're
the 155 millimeter. So this is something you're looking for in the long term and to speed up as quickly as possible. The West is saying that they're going to have 800,000 shells. Well, not the West. America says they're going to have 800,000 shells produced by being produced in 2024, if I remember correctly. And I did the math myself after looking at some of the numbers. It would look like if we're believing the numbers coming out, it'll be somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000.
That's good.
Is that all the shells I would want? No, of course I want more. I would want more for Ukraine. But if they can continue to increase that type of production, and not just the United States, but Europe, and getting the South Koreans involved as well, that 500,000 shell transfer was massive. That was extremely helpful. That type of stuff could really change the battlefield, especially if we're getting our Asian allies more involved in shell production and supporting the Ukrainian operations. That's just one element of the war, artillery shells.
Yeah, I personally don't see it. I think you would need fucking armor. You would need
Well, of course, I'm just giving you one element of the war. I would, and that, yeah, of course, they're going to need armor as well. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be domestic production of armor is going to start in Ukraine in 2024 on behalf of Rheinmetall, the German defense company. I think that the United States, after we see the success of Abrams or non-success of Abrams, we can make a decision to send more. We certainly have enough, just lounging about, doing fuck all, fighting no wars, hungry after Kuwait, you know? You know, you got to take them out to pasture every few weeks. This is the time.
But is it going to have the effect? Are you going to be able to out mass produce Russia, who is also fucking mass producing?
I think if a united Western coalition with Asian Pacific allies as well, yeah, and I think the stuff that we'd be producing would be of a higher quality as well, which is also something that we're not taking into consideration in this conversation. Western Abram tanks and Western Leopards are talked about. While they're not super tanks, they are of a higher quality and they protect the crew's lives more. The Russians, for all intents and purposes, seem to be taking noob crews, to put it bluntly, or crews that are not that experienced, putting them in tanks and sending them into assault teams. That's not a good way to get an experienced crew who can disable a ton of tanks, who can last for a while, that, you know, will be able to have a high survivability. I think those types of mistakes could lead to the Russians taking much higher casualties than they need to.
All right, I'll leave it with this because I really don't want to take up a lot of your time, dude. I personally think that if actually advocating for peace would actually benefit Ukraine, for them to get their defenses, whatever they need, and one day maybe join NATO.
Let me wait. I got it. The defenses thing kills me. Why would giving up Avdiivka and these other defendable positions that have been built up for 8 years, and to give up more Ukrainian cities to build new defense positions? How is that? I
don't think they have to give up Avdiivka. I mean, you said the
Donbass. You said the Donbass definitely.
No, hell no. I'm talking about lines right now. Like lines right now, that will be the fucking board. Like you, I mean, you're gonna have.
So you want to freeze the contact line? That's what your actual proposal. Okay.
I mean, okay. The Minsk Accord was bullshit. Whatever, but it did relatively stop the war. Like people were still shelling each other, blah, 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 right? But you didn't have these mass advances or mass counteroffensive or none of this bullshit, right? On any side, on Ukraine's side or the quote unquote rebels at the time. That's what I would look for. I mean, you don't have to give up Avdiivka. Who cares?
Why would the Russians accept freezing the contact line right now, considering that they're launching massive offensive on places like Avdiivka?
Well, I mean, because the war is continuing, but I'm pretty sure if you get China, especially China, involved in peace talks, and China, for what it's worth,
what is China going to do? What is China going to do that's so special that's going to bring the Ukrainians to be like, you know what? We'll abandon all this land, and it'll make the Russians say, you know what? I don't need to capture
the Ukrainians, but the Russians. You don't think China has leverage on Russia? Like they can get.
They do have a certain amount of leverage, but do I think that they're going to say, if you don't accept this deal, we're going to do X, Y, and Z? No, I don't. What do you think they're going to threaten? We're not going to trade with Russia unless they make peace with Ukraine. What do you think they're going to threaten?
I think China can twist the arm of Russia, and they have taken.
In what way?
Like you said, extreme, whatever.
How would they twist their arm?
Whatever,
could you just and suggest what way that would twist their arm that would be sufficient enough for Putin to take whatever political hit would come with giving up on Donetsk and Luhansk?
I would say I don't think China will go that far to be like, oh, we're gonna cut all fucking trade with Russia because they don't want a peace deal here, peace deal there. But I personally think that fucking Russia would take a fucking good deal for them and a deal for Ukraine with themselves. Again, like, and I say this as coming from a perspective of the war is Ukraine losing the end of this war if it becomes a bogged down fucking war of attrition. I do see it that way.
The defender does have an advantage, though.
Ukraine has the advantage to win a war of attrition in the long run.
It depends on the conditions of the war. I've already explained my position.
Hear you. Hold on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hello? I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, you did explain it, but
the logistics that for you to get enough armor there, the armor you need to take back these cities, the fucking shells that you need at the exact same time, or the strategies you're gonna need. What is that?
What the fuck the logistics to get the armor there? What is the logistics? What makes it logistically impossible? Or the strategies you're gonna use? Oh, what? Can the Ukrainians not think hard enough? Or they think
well, let me give you an example. There's gonna be an offensive to take Mariupol. You're gonna need fucking armor to break through the defensive lines, right? For sure. And you're gonna need HIMARS to blow up fucking KA-52s in the back. You're gonna need blow up ammo depots. You're gonna need all that shit. You're gonna put all that shit in the front. Satellites are gonna catch you. Drones are gonna catch you. Russians are gonna drop an immense amounts of fucking artillery shots on you. You're probably not even gonna be able to set up the army you need for you to go on that type of offensive. This is what I mean. I just don't see it, man. I really, really don't see it. And this is coming from a Twitter
I was waiting for like the impossibility thing, and all you just said was like you're gonna need HIMARS, you're gonna need drones, you're gonna need weapons, and you're gonna need to fight hard. That's all I heard. I didn't. What did you say that was impossible?
Let's in this counteroffensive, in the beginning, in the initial beginning of the first waves. The first waves, you did have the best. You had the fucking Leopards. You had the Bradleys. Did you have the Challengers?
They had some, yeah.
They had some Challengers, right? And what happened, dude?
Some of them got destroyed.
They got stopped, like completely stopped. Like whether it was mines, whether it was the alligator helicopter, whether it was fucking artillery. It got stopped. Like that's what the fuck I mean, dude. Like I just don't think that this type of warfare Ukraine will be able to keep this fight up, or let alone
what the fuck? What was I supposed to take from that? What you just told me, that they had tanks, they had advanced tanks. They used some of those tanks to attack the front line in the most fortified positions, and then they got destroyed and damaged.
They bashed their head into a fucking fortified line,
and because of
heavy losses and lost armor.
And because of that, it is impossible to capture any cities. It is impossible to capture any territory. Well, then I guess the Russians are just attacking for no fucking reason. Then they can't capture anything.
The Russians are borderline retarded, dude. Like they're
not borderline retarded.
60,000 men to take back Mute. Like that is also unsustainable. Like I fucking believe that any army that goes on the offensive is going to take huge amounts of fucking loss.
What you're saying is both the Ukrainian and Russian war effort is unsustainable. And
but one of them has more sustainability, and that is the Russian side. And I think it would
depending
benefit
upon
Ukraine.
what. Okay. Would you?
Go ahead.
The Western allies altogether, if they put their foot on the gas, could produce more than the Russians, and it would be of a higher quality. Do you agree or do you disagree?
It just depends on what you're talking about. If
anything,
you
everything.
Missile,
I mean planes. I mean tanks. I mean rifle. I mean everything.
Okay. If you want to consider quote unquote better, sure, I could say yeah.
Okay, and they could produce more, right?
Yes, and to get them to the front line without
I don't even think the Ukrainians necessarily even need more, right? Because the Ukrainians.
No, they of course need more because they're going to be the offensive army. Of course, they need more. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, you know what? We've been talking about this for a while.
Yeah, we have, dude.
I think it's time to wrap it up.
All right, Dylan. I love you. And I watch your streams. And everything else, except for this fucking issue, I disagree with you. I mean, everything else, I agree with you.
Oh, well, this is my key issue.
Yeah, but you talk about Israel, I 100% agree on Israel. You talk about Syria.
Yeah.
Syria, I disagree here and there. And vote blue no matter who. Fuck it, dude. I'm a leftist, but if it comes to Biden and Trump, you got to vote fucking Biden. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Bye-bye.
All right. See you later, dude.
Man, I just could not agree with him less.